There are certain stories that lodge themselves in the dark corners of our collective mind. They are not neat narratives with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They are fragments. They are whispers. They are stories that unravel into a frayed edge, leaving behind a silence that is louder and more terrifying than any scream. These are the tales that get under our skin, that haunt the back rooms of our history like a restless spirit, not just because they are about the unknown, but because they hint at the truly unknowable. They are wounds in the pages of history, blank spaces where a chapter has been torn out, leaving us to forever wonder what was written there. And tonight we are going to talk about the first, the most famous, and perhaps the most chilling of all of America's great foundational unsolved mysteries. This is not a story about a single missing person, a lost ship, or a vanished airplane. This is a story about the complete and total evaporation of an entire community. Men, women, and children who stepped off the edge of the known world and into the sprawling, unmapped wilderness of a new one, and were swallowed whole, leaving behind nothing but a profound, deafening silence and a single cryptic word, carved like a scar into a living tree. This is the story of the Roanoke Colony. To truly begin to understand the depth of this mystery, I want you to step out of your own time. I want you to imagine yourself in the boots of a man named John White. The year is 1590. For 3 long, agonizing, soul-crushing years, you have been trapped in England, an ocean away from everyone you love. You have been fighting, begging, borrowing, and bartering to find a way back to the family you were forced to leave behind. You are an artist by trade, a governor by title, but most importantly, you are a father and a grandfather. Your daughter, Eleanor, and your granddaughter, Virginia, are waiting for you across the treacherous, seemingly infinite expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Virginia Dare, your granddaughter, the first English child born in the New World. Her birth was a symbol of a new beginning, a tiny flicker of hope in a vast, dark wilderness. Finally, after years of war, political upheaval, and bureaucratic frustration, you have secured passage. The journey has been hellish. You've had to hitch a ride with a fleet of privateers, men more interested in Spanish gold than in your desperate relief mission. You've been attacked by pirates off the coast of Europe. You've been battered by storms that threaten to tear your ship apart. But none of that matters now, because you are here. Your ship is anchored off the coast of Roanoke Island, in the humid, mosquito-thick air of what will one day become North Carolina. The night is alive with the chirping of crickets and the croaking of frogs, a symphony you've grown to miss, the sound of the new world. This is the place. You and your small shore party row towards the island, your hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and a cold, creeping dread. You sound a trumpet, the brassy notes cutting through the darkness, hoping for an answer from the watchman at the settlement. You shout the familiar calls of an English watch. You sing English songs. Only the sound of the waves crashing on the shore and the rustle of the wind in the tall marsh grasses answers you. The silence from the island is unnatural. It is a heavy, smothering blanket. As the gray light of dawn begins to bleed across the sky, you find the settlement. Or rather, you find the empty space where it used to be. It is gone. Utterly, eerily, impossibly gone. There are no bodies. There are no skeletons picked clean by scavengers. There are no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains in the dirt, no scorch marks from a fire. The houses, the small wattle and daub cottages your people had so painstakingly built, have been taken down. Not burned to the ground, not smashed to splinters in a rage, but carefully, methodically dismantled. The heavy timbers, the thatched roofs, all of it carried away as if they were being packed up and moved. You see a high palisade, a defensive wall of thick logs, has been built around the settlement area, something that wasn't there when you left 3 years ago. This gives you a flicker of hope. They had time to build a fort. They were organized. They were preparing for a long stay. You search frantically for the secret sign you all agreed upon. Before you left, you gave them specific instructions. You knew they might have to move. You told them that if they had to leave Roanoke, they should carve their destination into a tree or a prominent post. And you told them, with a father's fear, that if they were in distress, if they had been forced to leave against their will, they should carve a Maltese cross above the name of their new location. Your men fan out, their voices hushed and nervous in the strange, morning light. They check every tree, every post. And then one of them calls out. You hurry over, your heart in your throat. And there it is, carved into a large post at the entrance to the dismantled fort. In big, clear Roman letters is a single word. Croton. Just that. No other message. No other symbol. And most importantly, no Maltese cross. Just that one word. Croton. The name of a nearby island, about 50 miles to the south. The name of a tribe of Native Americans. A tribe whose chief, Manteo, was your friend, your ally. It was meant to be an answer. A clue. A message of hope. We are safe. We are with Manteo's people. We are at Croton. But the storm that had battered your ships on the way here is gathering strength again. The sky is turning a bruised, ominous purple. The captain of the vessel, a hardened privateer, refuses to risk his ship or his crew to take you those last 50 miles. Your supplies are dangerously low. Your men are spooked by the ghostly emptiness of the settlement. The season is late. To linger on this coast, known for its hurricanes, is to risk certain death. You are forced to turn back, to sail away from that island, leaving that single silent word to be weathered by the sun and the salt spray, your hope turning to ash in your mouth. You will never see your daughter or your granddaughter again. You will never set foot in the New World again. You will die in Ireland years later, an old man, haunted by that word, by that final unanswered message. And with your departure, the 117 souls of the Roanoke colony, 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children pass out of history and into the realm of legend. They become America's original ghost story, the Lost Colony. Their disappearance is the foundational mystery of American history, a cold case that is now over 430 years old, and one of the most enduring and unsettling unsolved historical mysteries in the entire world. What happened to them? Were they slaughtered by unseen enemies? Did they starve in a land of supposed plenty? Or did they simply walk away from their old lives and into the heart of the American wilderness to begin a new one? What does that one lonely word truly mean? Tonight we will pick up John White's cold trail. We will sift through the meager evidence, the rampant rumors, and the outright lies. We will travel back in time to an age of brutal ambition, desperate hope, and profound, terrifying mystery. To even begin to understand what might have happened to the lost colonists, we have to understand why they were there in the first place. The story of Roanoke is not a simple, pious tale of pilgrims seeking religious freedom, like the Mayflower story we all learn in school. This was a thoroughly modern venture, born of cutthroat ambition, national pride, staggering greed, and the larger-than-life ego of one of the most dazzling, complicated, and controversial figures of the Elizabethan age, Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was the definition of a Renaissance man on overdrive. He was a brilliant poet, a battle-hardened soldier, a cunning spy for the Queen, a dashing courtier, an intrepid explorer, and a privateer, which is a polite and government-sanctioned word for a pirate. He was handsome, charming, quick-witted, and a famous favorite of the formidable Queen Elizabeth I. In the 1580s, England was a rising power, but it was a nervous one. It looked across the Channel with a mixture of envy and mortal fear at the vast global empire of its great Catholic rival, Spain. Spain was the world's first superpower, pulling mountains of gold and silver out of its colonies in the New World. This treasure funded Spain's massive armies and its invincible armada, making it the dominant force in Europe. Raleigh and a circle of other English war hawks and imperial dreamers saw the Americas as the key to England's future survival and prosperity. A permanent English colony in the New World could serve two primary hard-nosed purposes. First, and most importantly, it could serve as a forward operating base for English privateers to raid the Spanish treasure fleets as they sailed up the coast of Florida along the Gulf Stream, heavy with the riches of Mexico and Peru. It was a strategic plan to get rich by stealing from the people who were getting rich by stealing from the native peoples of the Americas. Second, it would be a powerful symbolic foothold, a declaration that England was now a major player on the world stage, ready to challenge Spain for control of this vast, new continent. It was an act of geopolitical defiance. In 1584, Raleigh, armed with a royal charter from the Queen, sent a reconnaissance mission to scout a location for his colony. The two ships, captained by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, landed on the outer banks of what is now North Carolina. The reports they brought back to London were pure marketing genius, painting a picture of an earthly paradise. They described the land as a Garden of Eden, the soil as impossibly rich, and the native people as most gentle, loving, and faithful, void of all guile and treason, and such as live after the manner of the Golden Age. To prove their point, they brought back two living examples of these noble savages, two men from the Croton tribe named Manteo and Wanchese, who became sensations at the Elizabethan court. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda. The Queen was delighted. Raleigh was knighted. The venture was funded. The stage was set for England's first great colonial experiment. But this early manufactured optimism hid a much darker and more complicated reality. The location they had chosen, Roanoke Island, was in fact a terrible place for a colony. The Outer Banks are a thin, shifting ribbon of sand, a transient barrier island constantly being reshaped by the sea. They are directly in the path of Atlantic hurricanes. The soil is sandy and poor. The waters of the sounds are shallow and treacherous, full of shifting sandbars, a region that would later become known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, for the sheer number of ships it has claimed over the centuries. And the gentle natives were not a single monolithic people. They were a complex patchwork of different Algonquian-speaking tribes with their own histories, alliances, and bitter rivalries. The initial English interactions, while sometimes marked by curiosity and friendly trade, were far more often marred by a profound and deadly cultural misunderstanding, English arrogance, and a quick resort to violence. This brings us to the first attempt at a colony, the 1585 military expedition. This was not a civilian settlement. It was a fort, an all-male military outpost, manned by about 100 soldiers and specialists. It was led by a man named Sir Richard Grenville, a cousin of Raleigh's, and a soldier with a notoriously short temper. This expedition was a public relations disaster for the English. Instead of building bridges with the local tribes, they burned them. The most infamous incident occurred when the English accused a nearby village, Aquascagok, of stealing a silver cup. When the cup wasn't immediately returned, Grenville's response was swift and brutal. He ordered the entire village and its cornfields to be burned to the ground, an act of shocking, disproportionate retribution over a minor piece of tableware. This single act of violence poisoned the well of English-native relations for years to come. It turned suspicion into fear, and fear into a simmering, vengeful hatred. The 1585 colony lasted less than a year, facing dwindling supplies, starvation, and increasing hostility from the natives they had so thoroughly alienated. The soldiers were more than happy to abandon the entire enterprise when the famous English privateer Sir Francis Drake made a surprise visit on his way back from raiding Spanish ports in the Caribbean. They packed up their belongings and went home to England. The first Roanoke colony had failed miserably. But Walter Raleigh was not a man who gave up easily. His pride and his fortune were on the line. He decided to try again. But this time it would be different. This time it wouldn't be a military outpost of rough soldiers looking for a fight. It would be a real, permanent settlement, a proper English town, a civilian colony. To ensure its permanence, he would send families, men, women, and children, to entice them to make the dangerous journey. He offered each man a 500-acre plot of land. This was to be the city of Raleigh, the first English metropolis in the New World. The governor of this ambitious and hopeful new enterprise was John White, the very same artist who had been on the previous expeditions. His beautiful watercolor paintings of the native people, the local flora, and the fauna are our only visual record of this lost world. He was, by all accounts, a more thoughtful, patient, and diplomatic man than Grenville, and this time he was personally invested in a way he hadn't been before. His own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, a bricklayer named Ananias Dare, were among the colonists. In the early summer of 1587, a small fleet of 3 ships carrying 117 colonists set sail from England. Their plan, their official charter, was not to resettle the cursed Roanoke Island. Their destination was the Chesapeake Bay, further north. The Chesapeake was a much more promising location, with deep-water harbors for shipping, vast, fertile lands for farming, and hopefully, friendlier natives who hadn't been antagonized by Richard Grenville. This was a much better plan. A plan for survival. But it's not what happened. And this is the first great, catastrophic turning point in the tragic story of the lost colony. The pilot of the fleet, the man in charge of navigation, was a Portuguese sailor named Simon Fernandez. He was a highly experienced navigator, a man who knew the American coastline well. But he was also a privateer at heart, and he was in a hurry. When the fleet reached Roanoke Island in late July, they stopped only to check on a small garrison of 15 men that Grenville had left behind the previous year. They found nothing but a single skeleton, a grim omen of what was to come. The fort had been destroyed. The men were gone, likely killed by the natives Grenville had angered. It was at this point that Simon Fernandez put his foot down. He refused to take the colonists any further north to the Chesapeake. He claimed the season was too late, that summer was almost over. He was impatient to get back to the Caribbean for a season of profitable privateering before the winter storms set in. John White was aghast. He argued, he pleaded, he protested, but Fernandez was the master of the ships, and his word was law at sea. The colonists' 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children were unceremoniously dumped on Roanoke Island, the one place on the entire American continent they had specifically intended to avoid, a place with bad soil, a treacherous harbor, and a local population that now had every reason to despise them and see them as a returning plague. What were Fernandez's true motives? Was he simply an impatient privateer, eager to chase Spanish gold? Or was there something more sinister at play? Some historians have theorized that Fernandez, who had a checkered past and had sailed for the Spanish before, may have been a double agent, deliberately sabotaging the English colony by leaving it in the most vulnerable and doomed position possible. There's no definitive proof of this, but at the very least, his selfish and reckless decision was a de facto death sentence for the colony's original, more hopeful plan. So there they were, stranded in a hostile landscape. They tried to repair the derelict houses of the 1585 settlement. They tried to re-establish contact with the local tribes, but the poison had taken root. Shortly after they landed, one of the colonists, a man named George Howe, was out crabbing alone in the shallows. His body was found later, riddled with 16 arrows, his head bashed in. The message from the local Secotan tribe was brutally clear. They were not welcome. They were not safe. Amidst this constant state of fear and uncertainty, there was a single moment of profound joy. On August 18, 1587, John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Virginia, the first English child born in the New World. She was a powerful symbol of hope, a promise of a future, in a place that seemed to have none. But symbols don't fill empty stomachs. Their supplies, meant for a colony starting in the fertile Chesapeake, were dwindling rapidly. The sandy soil of Roanoke was not yielding a quick harvest. It became terrifyingly clear to everyone that unless they got help from England, and soon, they would not survive the coming winter. They needed someone to go back, to cross the ocean again, to plead their case to Sir Walter Raleigh, and to return with food, tools, weapons, and reinforcements. After much debate, they chose their governor, John White. By his own account, he did not want to go. He wrote in his journal that the colonists, with one voice, begged him to return, and that he only agreed sore against his will. He was terrified of being seen as a man who was abandoning his people, his family, his own daughter and newborn grandchild, in their moment of greatest need. He feared that sinister and slanderous reports would destroy his reputation. But he knew it was their only chance. So they made a plan, the famous, fateful plan that has echoed down the centuries. The colonists would try to survive the winter, and if possible, they would move, likely 50 miles into the Main, meaning 50 miles inland to a safer, more fertile location away from the hostile coastal tribes. If they moved, they would carve their destination into a tree. And, crucially, if they were in trouble, if they were taken by force, they would add the sign of a Maltese cross. At the end of August 1587, John White sailed for England, leaving behind 117 colonists. He promised his daughter, that he would return with help the following spring. He would not see Roanoke again for 3 long, agonizing years. John White arrived in England in November 1587 to find a nation in a state of total panic. England was on a war footing. King Philip II of Spain, furious at years of English privateering and Protestant defiance, had assembled the largest and most powerful naval fleet the world had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. Its singular goal was to invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and extinguish English independence once and for all. Every available English ship, every able-bodied sailor, every barrel of gunpowder was requisitioned by the Crown for the desperate defense of the realm. Raleigh's planned relief mission for Roanoke was cancelled. All civilian voyages were suspended. The fate of 117 people on the other side of the world was a tragic but necessary footnote in a struggle for national survival. White was trapped. He made 2 desperate, under-the-table attempts to get a small relief vessel to sea, but both were thwarted by bureaucratic red tape, bad luck, and pirates. In the summer of 1588, the English, with a combination of superior naval tactics, smaller and more maneuverable ships, and a Protestant wind that smashed the Spanish fleet against the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, achieved a miraculous victory over the Armada. But the war with Spain was far from over. It would drag on for years, a long, grinding conflict that consumed England's resources. It was not until 1590, 3 years after he had left, that a desperate John White was finally able to secure passage back to Roanoke. It wasn't a dedicated relief mission funded by Raleigh. It was a deal with the devil. He had to hitch a ride with a fleet of privateers who agreed to stop at Roanoke, but only after they had spent a profitable summer hunting for Spanish treasure in the Caribbean. The colonists were an afterthought. And this brings us back to that dark, humid, fateful night in August 1590. Back to the sound of the trumpet echoing in the darkness. Back to the empty settlement, the dismantled houses, the silent waiting fort, and the single cryptic maddening word, Croton. So what does it mean? What really happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke? This is where recorded history ends and the investigation begins. We have a crime scene, a list of victims, and a single baffling clue. Let's examine the suspects and the theories, one by one, like detectives on a 430-year-old cold case. Theory number 1, annihilation by the Spanish. This is, on the surface, a very logical and compelling theory. Spain was England's mortal enemy. They viewed the English colony at Roanoke not just as an encroachment on territory they claimed as their own, but as a direct national security threat, a den of pirates and heretics, situated right on the doorstep of their vital treasure fleet routes. And the Spanish had a well-documented history of dealing with rival European colonies with extreme prejudice. In 1565, they had located a French Huguenot colony at Fort Caroline in what is now Jacksonville, Florida. The Spanish commander, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, ordered a surprise attack and massacred almost everyone, hanging some of the bodies from trees with a sign that read, "I do this not as to Frenchmen but as to Lutherans." They certainly knew about Roanoke. Spanish ambassadors in London were sending detailed intelligence reports back to King Philip about Raleigh's venture. And for years, the Spanish sent multiple search parties from their bases in Florida and the Caribbean to find and destroy the English settlement. So, did one of these search parties finally find the 1587 colony and wipe it out just as they had the French? The evidence against this theory is surprisingly strong. First, the Spanish were meticulous, almost obsessive record keepers. We have their ship logs, their military reports, their official correspondence, their spy reports. There is not a single document in the vast Spanish archives that mentions finding or destroying the 1587 Roanoke colony. The search parties they sent always came back empty-handed, or reported finding only the remains of the abandoned 1585 fort. The last major Spanish search in 1600 found no trace of the colonists at all. If they had achieved a major military victory by wiping out Raleigh's colony, it is almost certain they would have documented it and probably boasted about it. And then there's the crime scene itself. If a Spanish military force had attacked the colony, the scene would have been one of violence and destruction. Burned buildings, bodies, the clear signs of a battle. Instead, John White found a settlement that had been carefully and peacefully taken apart. Most importantly, the central Clusiaroatoan makes no sense. Why would the colonists carve a message pointing to Croton Island if they had been attacked and were about to be killed by the Spanish? The Spanish theory, while logical in its motive, simply doesn't fit the physical evidence at the scene. Theory number 2, massacre by Native Americans. This is perhaps the most popular and enduring image of the colonists' fate, the one that has been depicted in plays, books, and movies for generations, that they were overwhelmed and slaughtered by the local tribes they had antagonized. There is certainly strong evidence for motive. As we saw, the 1585 military expedition under the hot-headed Richard Grenville had already created powerful enemies. The brutal killing of the colonist George Howe right after the 1587 landing proved that at least some of the local tribes were actively hostile. The English were intruders, invaders with strange customs and a powerful god. They were settling on native land, consuming their resources, and disrupting their way of life. It's not hard to imagine a confederation of tribes, perhaps led by the once friendly but now embittered Wanchis, deciding that this foreign threat needed to be eliminated once and for all. In fact, years later, we get what appears to be a direct confession. When the English established their first successful colony at Jamestown in 1607, 20 years after White left Roanoke, Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame explored the region and interacted with the powerful chief of the Powhatan Confederacy. According to Smith's own writings, Chief Powhatan claimed that he himself had wiped out the Roanoke colonists. He said they had left Roanoke Island and had settled among the Chesapeake tribe in Powhatan's territory. Powhatan, seeing them as a threat, claimed he had attacked them and eliminated them. As proof, he supposedly showed Smith certain articles that had belonged to the Roanoke settlers. This seems like a smoking gun, the solution to the mystery. Case closed. But again, when you look closer, the details don't quite fit. If the colonists were massacred by Powhatan's warriors or any other tribe, why did John White find no bodies back at Roanoke in 1590? No signs of a battle? Why would a victorious war party allow the colonists time to carefully dismantle their own houses before killing them? And the central Clusiaroatoane makes no sense in this context. If they had moved inland and were attacked by Powhatan, why would the clue at Roanoke point south to Croton Island? It's a clear contradiction. And what about Powhatan's confession? It's possible he was telling the truth, that he had indeed attacked a group of survivors who had moved north. Or, it's just as possible that he was boasting to the newly arrived English at Jamestown. It could have been a political power move, a way to intimidate the new arrivals by taking credit for the disappearance of the previous colony. The message would have been clear. See what happened to the last people who tried to settle here without my permission? Don't make the same mistake. A violent end at the hands of native warriors is a strong and plausible possibility, but it fails to explain the strange, orderly, and cryptic nature of the scene John White found at the original settlement site. This brings us to the theory that, for many modern historians and archaeologists, is the most likely, the most logical, and the most elegant explanation. The theory that takes the colonists at their word. Theory number 3. Assimilation with the Croton tribe. Let's look at the evidence again from the perspective of the colonists in late 1587. You are a group of 117 people. You are running out of food and European supplies. You feel abandoned by your own country. You are surrounded by potential enemies who have already demonstrated their willingness to kill you. But you have one group of steadfast friends, the Croton people, who live on a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island. Their chief, Manteo, has been to London with you, has been treated as a nobleman by your queen, and has been baptized as a Christian. He is a trusted ally, a bridge between your two worlds. What is the most logical, rational thing for you to do in this desperate situation? Do you stay put and starve? Or do you pack up your belongings and go seek refuge with the only people you know you can trust? This theory perfectly explains every piece of the puzzle at the crime scene. They carved Croton because that's exactly where they were going. It explains the lack of the Maltese cross. They were not in distress. They were leaving willingly, according to a prearranged plan with their allies. It explains the carefully dismantled houses. They took the valuable timbers, nails, and other materials with them to build new homes in their new community. It explains the lack of bodies or signs of a struggle. There was no battle at the Roanoke settlement. They just left. John White himself believed this. His first reaction upon seeing the word was not despair, but relief. He wrote in his journal, "I greatly joyed that I had safely found a certain token of their safe being at Croton, where Manteo was born, and the savages of the island are friends." His plan was to sail to Croton immediately. He was prevented only by the hurricane and his mutinous crew. He died believing his family was alive and safe on Croton Island. But is there any hard, physical evidence to support this theory beyond the carving on the post? For centuries, there was only rumor, folklore, and hearsay. The Jamestown colonists, in the early 1600s, heard persistent stories from the natives about people living in the interior who looked like them, who had two-story stone houses, and who knew how to read a book. Later settlers in North Carolina in the 18th and 19th centuries noted that some members of the local Lumbee tribe had surprisingly European features, blonde hair, and gray eyes, and that their surnames were often the same as those of the lost colonists. The Lumbee themselves have a long oral tradition that they are descended from the Roanoke survivors. For a long time, that's all there was. But in recent decades, archaeology has begun to provide tantalizing, physical proof that may finally corroborate this theory. An organization called the First Colony Foundation, led by archaeologist Mark Horton and his teams, has conducted extensive excavations not on Roanoke Island, but on Hatteras Island, the historical location of the Croton tribe's main village. And they have found things, significant things. They have found a remarkable concentration of late 16th century English pottery, mixed in directly with native pottery in the same undisturbed archaeological layers. This isn't just a few traded trinkets. It's domestic pottery, the kind of thing families would use every day. They have found parts of English flintlock muskets, metalworking tools, a pair of dressmaker's shears, and part of the hilt of an English rapier. They found a small lead tablet that was used for writing and drawing with a stylus. They even found a gold signet ring believed to have belonged to one of the original 1585 colonists. The sheer quantity and the domestic nature of these artifacts strongly suggest a sustained English presence, a group of people living, working, and building new lives alongside the Croton people. This is the closest we have ever come to a smoking gun. The archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island strongly suggests that at least some, and perhaps a significant number, of the Roanoke colony survivors made their way to Croton Island and began a long, slow process of assimilation. They became, in effect, Croton. But this theory, as compelling and evidence-based as it is, still leaves nagging questions. If they survived, why did they never make a concerted effort to make contact with later English arrivals at Jamestown? Why did they seem to lose their language and customs so completely that no definitive trace remained? Perhaps the assimilation was so total that, after a generation or two, the memory of England faded into legend. Perhaps they were scattered by intertribal warfare, absorbed into different communities in smaller groups that were harder to identify. And perhaps they fell victim to the most devastating force of all, disease. The epidemics of smallpox, measles, and influenza that Europeans brought with them were apocalyptic for native populations who had no immunity. It's possible the Roanoke survivors, living among their native allies, were simply caught up in this biological holocaust. Their unique hybrid community tragically wiped out before it could ever be found by other Englishmen. The Croton theory is the most logical, but it may not be the whole story. The truth may be more fragmented. This leads us to another closely intertwined possibility. Theory number 4. The inland migration, a split party, and the Darestones. Let's go back to the plan John White left them with. Move 50 miles into the main. Croton Island was to the south, not on the mainland. Some archaeologists, like the late Professor E.C. Billy Ray Harrison of the First Colony Foundation, have focused on this part of the plan. They believe the colonists may have split into 2 or more groups. One, perhaps a smaller group, went south to seek immediate refuge with their Croton allies on Hatteras Island. But the main body of colonists, as originally planned, headed west up the Albemarle Sound, looking for a better, more defensible, and more permanent place to settle. The archaeological evidence for this is more recent and still highly debated. At a location now known as Site X, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke, near the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers, archaeologists have unearthed a small but significant collection of English pottery that is stylistically identical to the finds on Hatteras Island. This could suggest that a second group of colonists did indeed try to make a go of it on the mainland, perhaps for several years. And it is in the context of this inland migration that the story takes one of its most bizarre and controversial turns. This is the strange tale of the Darestones. In November of 1937, a California tourist and produced buyer named Lewis E. Hammond claimed to have found a strange, inscribed stone while hunting for hickory nuts near the Chowan River in North Carolina. The stone was a 21-pound piece of quartz, and crudely carved onto its 2 flat surfaces was a message. It appeared to be a letter from the grave, from Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter. Told a tragic story. It said that after White left, The colony was ravaged by sickness and Indian attacks, and that 2/3 of the colonists, including her husband Ananias and her daughter Virginia, had died. It ended with the haunting words, "All dead but 7. The stone was signed EWD. It was a potential bombshell, a Rosetta Stone for the Roanoke mystery. A history professor at Emory University in Atlanta named Haywood Pierce Jr. examined the stone and became convinced it was genuine. He staked his academic reputation on it and became obsessed with finding more. He offered a public reward for any other similar stones that could be found. And that's when the floodgates opened, and the story descended into farce. A Georgia stone carver and jack-of-all-trades named Bill Eberhart came forward, claiming to have found a second stone, and then a third, and then a fourth. In total, Eberhart discovered 47 more stones, which told the rest of Eleanor's epic tale. How she was taken in by a friendly chief, how she eventually married him, had more children, and traveled across Georgia and the Carolinas, leaving a trail of inscribed stones like breadcrumbs, until she was finally killed. It was an incredible soap operatic tale. It was also almost certainly a complete and elaborate fraud. The sheer number of stones, the convenient way they told a continuous narrative, and Eberhardt's shady character and financial motives led most historians and a 1941 Saturday Evening Post expose to conclude that he had faked all of them to claim the reward. The scandal tainted the entire discovery, including the first stone. To this day, the authenticity of that first, original stone, the Chowan stone, remains a subject of intense academic debate. Most scholars dismiss it as the first in a series of hoaxes, but a stubborn few hold out that it might be real. It remains another tantalizing, but probably false, trail in this labyrinth of a mystery. And finally, as with any great unsolved mystery, we have to acknowledge the theories that live on the fringes, the explanations that are born more of folklore and primal fear than of hard evidence. Could they have simply starved to death, or fallen victim to a devastating disease shortly after White left? This is almost certainly part of the story. Life in the 16th century New World was brutal and precarious. But a simple story of starvation or sickness doesn't explain the lack of bodies or the carefully dismantled settlement. Could they have met a more gruesome and unspeakable end? There are dark whispers in the folklore of the Algonquian peoples of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of starvation and winter that can possess a person and drive them to cannibalism. Could a desperate, starving, isolated group of colonists have turned on each other in the harsh winter months? It's a terrifying, cinematic thought, but one with absolutely no evidence to support it. And in our modern age, new layers of theory have been plastered on top of the old mystery. Alien abduction, a time slip, a portal to another dimension opened by the strange energies of the Outer Banks. These ideas say far more about our own modern anxieties and our love of science fiction than they do about the likely fate of 117 people in 1587. They are the modern folklore we tell ourselves when faced with a profound and unsettling silence. So, after sifting through 4 centuries of clues, theories, hoaxes, and dead ends, where do we find ourselves? The truth of what happened to the Roanoke colony is probably not one single, simple answer. It is likely a complex, fragmented, and ultimately tragic story made up of several of these theories. The weight of the evidence points most strongly towards assimilation. The majority of the colonists, facing starvation and abandonment, likely went to live with their Croton allies on Hatteras Island. A smaller, secondary group may have attempted to forge a new life 50 miles inland, as planned. Over the years, these small, scattered groups would have been absorbed into the larger native population. Their Englishness, their language, their religion, would have been diluted with each passing generation. They would have intermarried, learned new customs, and raised their children as members of the tribe. And they would have been incredibly vulnerable. The diseases that Europeans brought with them were an invisible, unstoppable apocalypse for native populations who had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the Americas, wiping out up to 90% of the population in some areas. The Roanoke survivors and their descendants, living among the natives, would have been caught in this biological holocaust. They didn't just vanish into thin air. They likely faded away. Their story became a memory, then a legend, passed down around native campfires, until the details grew hazy and were finally lost to the wind. But the real, enduring power of this mystery, the reason it continues to haunt American history and our popular imagination, is that we don't know for sure. It is the lack of a definitive ending that makes it America's quintessential ghost story. It's the first, and perhaps greatest, of the nation's missing persons cases. And at its heart is the profound personal tragedy of John White, a father and a grandfather who crossed an ocean twice, who fought against wars and pirates, only to be stopped by a storm and a single inscrutable word. A man who died without ever knowing the fate of his child and his grandchild. And that word, Croton, it was meant as an answer, a signpost, a reassurance. We are safe. We are here. But time, fate, and silence twisted its meaning. It became a question, curse, a single-word epitaph for a lost world. It hangs there, in the humid, salt-laced air of the Outer Banks, a whisper from a ghost you can almost, but not quite hear. So I want to leave you with that whisper tonight. What do you think happened to the 117 souls of the lost colony? I genuinely want to know. Head down to the comments and let me know your theory. Do you believe the archaeological evidence for the Croton theory is the final answer? Do you think there's any truth to the Dare stones? Or the inland migration? Do you have another theory altogether that we haven't discussed? The archaeological work on Hatteras Island and at Site X is ongoing. We may yet find a definitive answer, a piece of English pottery with a name scratched on it, a buried European skeleton, a piece of evidence that finally closes this 430-year-old cold case. If you enjoy diving into these unsolved historical mysteries, these stories that linger at the edge of our knowledge and refuse to give us easy answers, please make sure you subscribe and click that notification bell. There are so many more lost stories, forgotten people, and silent places for us to explore together. In the end, the story of Roanoke is a powerful and humbling reminder of how fragile a foothold civilization can be. It's a story about hope, ambition, and the terrifying power of the unknown. And it's a testament to how a small group of people, by simply disappearing, can leave a mystery so profound, so personal, and so haunting that it continues to echo through the centuries, carried on the wind in a single ghostly word, Croton.